In this lesson, we are going to cover how to set up Django and configure it for our database. So the steps for configuring the database are first to configure Django, and this means basically telling Django how it's going to connect to our database. Then we have to install our database adapter dependencies. So these are the dependencies that are required inside our Docker container in order for Django to connect to our database. And then finally, we are going to update our Python requirements to inside the Postgres adapter that Django needs in order to connect. So before Django can connect to our database, it needs to know the following. The engine, which is the type of database, in our case is going to be the Postgres engine. The host name is either the IP address or the domain name of the database. This is the address that Django will use to connect to the database. The port number is usually the default for Postgres, which is 5432. We are going to leave it as the default. Then we have the database name. This is the name of the actual database inside Postgres. Database systems like Postgres, MySQL, and SQL Server can each host multiple databases. For our purposes, we will be creating just one database for our recipe app. Then the username and password. It's just the username and password, the credentials our application needs to authenticate with the database. These are the credentials used specifically by our application. These settings are all defined inside our settings.py file. So here's a snippet from the settings.py file. You can see that each one of the different settings I mentioned previously are all listed here. You have got the engine, host, name, user, and the password, and this is all the information that Django needs in order to connect. And we are going to be pulling this information from environment variables. So don't worry too much about the environment variables code here. I'm going to show you how you do this. So, environment variables will be used to configure our database. We will set the configuration values using environment variables inside the Docker Compose. Then we will write a bit of Python code like you saw on the previous screen to pull those values from the environment and apply them to our settings.py file. This allows Django to connect to the database using the correct configuration. Environment variables are great because they can be easily passed to Docker containers. They are a standard and widely used method for configuring most Docker containers. And this can be used in both our local development and production environments. You can set them in the local configuration, as we saw in the previous lesson when we configured the Docker Compose file. You can also configure them in a production environment as well. I'll show you how to do that later on at the end of this course. And also this means you essentially have a single place to configure your project, as all configuration values are pulled from environment variables. So whenever you need to modify something in your deployed application, you can do it from one centralized location. And it's very easy to do with Python. You can also do it in some code like this. So we use os.environ.get with the name of the environment variable to retrieve its value. In this case, it pulls the value set in the db_host variable. We will use this same method for all the environment variables we define for our project. So now let's talk about this package called psycopg2, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly. Is the package that you need in order for Django to connect to our database. So it's what's known as the database adapter. So it is the most popular Postgres adapter for Python. So if you are using Python to connect to a Postgres database, you are most likely going to use the scopg2 package. And there's a couple of installation options that you have for installing scopg2. It's not the most simple package in the world because there are a couple of different options. The first option that lots of people take is to just install a package called scopg2-binary. No, this is recommended for development, or at least it's okay to use for local development. However, it's not recommended for your deploying if you are deploying your application to a production environment. And this is because it's a prepackaged binary file that it's necessarily optimized for the operating system that it's running on. The second option is just scopg2, and this is the same as the above but without the binary on the end. And scopg2 is installed from source, meaning it's compiled from the source code. You won't really notice this during installation. You can steal it using pip. However, behind the scenes, it's being compiled specifically for the operating system you are using. So if you are installing it on Linux, it's compiled for Linux. This gives it some advantages in terms of performance, reliability, and compatibility. The downside of these is that you need to have certain dependencies installed on your machine for it to compile properly. So if you try to install it without these dependencies, pip will throw an error saying it's missing a required package needed to build the scopg2 package. That's why many people default to the binary option, because it doesn't require these build dependencies and works reliably across most systems. However, as I mentioned earlier, the binary version has some drawbacks, such as a slightly reduced performance compared to the source compiled version. Installing scopg2 without the binary option is actually quite easy to do with Docker once you understand how it works. Since we are using Docker, package installations are consistent across all environments. We are using the same Docker image every time we run the project, so there's no need to worry about finding the right package for Mac OS, Windows, or any other OS because it's running inside a container. We know exactly which package we need to install, and we can easily include them in our Docker setup. So scopg2 is what we are going to be using in this course. So to install scopg2, they have a list of the package dependencies in the official documentation, and this list includes C compiler, Python 3-dev, libpq-dev. These are just the packages needed in order to install scopg2. However, these packages aren't always named the same across different package managers, so I had to do a bit of trial and error, but I eventually found the equivalent packages you need for Alpine are PostgreSQL-client, build-base, PostgreSQL-dev, and musl-dev. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the best practice for Docker is to clean up any build dependencies. Most of the dependencies listed here, except for the PostgreSQL-client, are only needed for installing the package. They are not actually required to run the package when the application is in use. So we are going to do is customize our Docker file to clean up these packages after we have used them. So then we can keep our Docker file very minimal and lightweight. So that's an overview of how we are going to configure our Django project to work with Postgres. Now let's move on to the next lesson.